Hello, and welcome to Boring Stories for Sleep. Tonight, as you settle in and allow the outside world to fade away, we invite you to join us on a quiet journey into the past. Our journey will not take us to grand battlefields or the halls of royal palaces, but to a forgotten corner on the edge of an American city, and to a mystery that remained silent for more than half a century. Our story begins in a time often viewed as one of innocence and order. America in the mid-1950s. A time of families moving to the suburbs, of new television sets gathering neighbors together, and a general sense of optimism in the post-war era. But beneath this placid surface, secrets could exist, and lives could be lost in silence. Tonight, we will follow such a secret, a story that begins with a cardboard box, discarded in a wooded area, the story of a child whom nobody knew and nobody claimed, a story that, for decades, would simply be known as the boy in the box. Do not worry, this is not a story meant to frighten you. It is a story of quiet persistence, of the men and women who dedicated their lives to solving a single puzzle, and of the power of science to give a name to the nameless. It is a meditation on memory, on how a person can vanish from the world almost without a trace. So, take a deep breath, let your muscles relax, and let your mind follow my voice. There is no need to focus too intently. Simply allow the story to unfold before you, like an old black and white film, as you drift slowly towards rest, towards peace, and towards sleep. And now, let us go back to the winter of 1957. It was February in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1957. The cold was a bone deep chill that settled in and stayed. The city, like many American cities of the time, moved to a steady rhythm. The groan of streetcars on their tracks, the distant sound of car horns, and the low industrial hum that never truly stopped. It was a hard-working city, a city of brick and steel, steeped in history but looking toward the future. On the outskirts of the city, where paved streets began to give way to country lanes, there were places that time seemed to have forgotten. One such place was an unpaved lane called Susquehanna Road, in the Fox Chase neighborhood. It was not a well-traveled road. It was a place where people sometimes dumped rubbish, a place for teenagers to seek privacy, or for trappers to pass through on their way into the woods. On one of those cold February days, a young college student was walking through this area. He was not there for any nefarious reason. He was checking on muskrat traps he had set, a simple rustic hobby in a place that had not yet been fully consumed by the suburbs. As he made his way through the tangled brush and trees, something out of place caught his eye. It was a large cardboard box, the kind used to ship a bassinet sold at the department store chain J.C. Penney. It was lying in a shallow ditch on the side of the lane. Curiosity, as it does, prompted him to look. What he saw inside sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the February weather. Inside the box, wrapped in a plaid blanket, was the body of a small boy. Imagine yourself in his place for a moment. A young man in his early 20s in an isolated spot, faced with a horrifying discovery. His first reaction was fear, not of the box, but of involvement. The police in the 1950s could be harsh, the questions relentless. He was afraid of being interrogated, doubted of this awful incident, drawing him into a world of trouble he wanted no part of. He had his studies, his life. This dark discovery had no place in it. So, he made a quiet decision. He turned, walked away, and left the box and its terrible secret behind. He kept what he saw to himself, a heavy burden in his silent memory. Days passed. The box remained where it was, almost hidden from view. A few cars might have driven by, but no one took notice. A few days later, another man was driving his car slowly down that same road. His name was John Stively. He had seen the box before, but thought little of it. This time, however, something prompted him to stop. Perhaps it was just a gut feeling, a sense that something was not right. He got out of his car and approached the ditch. He, too, looked inside, and unlike the student, he made a different decision. He got back in his car and drove straight to the nearest police station. The music pauses for a moment, replaced by the faint, steady sound of a police radio dispatcher. Then the quiet music fades back in. When the Philadelphia police arrived at the location, they approached the scene with practiced seriousness. They secured the area and began to carefully examine everything. The box itself was the first clue. A J.C. Penney bassinet box. The plaid blanket was the second. And then there was the boy himself. And here, the mystery deepened. It was clear he had lived a difficult life. His small frame showed signs of malnourishment, and there were old scars that told a story no one was there to tell. But there were other puzzling details. His hair had been recently cut, and crudely, as if someone had done it in a hurry. Small clippings of the hair still clung to his body. His fingernails were neatly and carefully trimmed. He had been bathed. He had been placed inside the box carefully, almost gently, his arms folded across his chest. This was not a violent, haphazard disposal of a body. It was something else. There was a confusing contradiction between the neglect he had apparently suffered in life and the care that seemed to have been taken after his death. The investigators stood in the February cold, looking at this silent, sorrowful scene. They had a crime scene. They had a victim. But what they did not have was the most important thing of all. A name. There was nothing to identify this child. No marked clothing. No papers, nothing. It was as if this little boy had appeared from nowhere. A child with no past, no identity, lying silently inside a cardboard box on a forgotten road. They didn't know it then, but that silence, that absence of a name, would last for decades, becoming one of the coldest and most melancholy mysteries in American crime history. The discovery on Susquehanna Road sent a quiet but immediate ripple through the Philadelphia Police Department. A case involving a child is always different. It carries a unique weight, a sense of urgency that transcends the normal rhythms of police work. The file was opened, a number was assigned, and the methodical process of seeking justice began. But the investigators faced a problem that was as unusual as it was profound. They had no starting point. There was no grieving family reporting a missing child, no frantic phone call, no abandoned car. There was only the boy, the box, and the blanket. The first step was to try and give the boy a face that the city could recognize. This led the investigators to make a decision that was unconventional and to many deeply sorrowful. They knew that distributing a typical clinical post-mortem photograph would likely repel the public. So, they attempted to create an image of life from death. The boy was seated upright and dressed in children's clothing. His eyes were gently closed. The resulting photograph was not of a victim, but of a sleeping child. It was a haunting illusion, created out of desperation, in the hopes that someone, somewhere, would see a flicker of familiarity. With this photograph, the largest publicity effort in the department's history was launched. Imagine the sound of the printing presses, running through the night, churning out thousands upon thousands of posters. Each poster featured the boy's sleeping face, along with the sparse details of the case and a simple, pleading question: do you know this child? These posters became a silent, ubiquitous presence across the city and the Delaware Valley. Detectives fanned out, their cars filled with stacks of the notices. They tacked them to the bulletin boards of post offices, where people lined up to buy stamps. They were placed in the windows of grocery stores, next to advertisements for bread and milk. They appeared in taverns, community centers, and government buildings. The boy's face, peaceful and still, looked out onto a city of millions. A silent question posed to every passerby. The initial hope was that this visual flood would quickly bring a name, a recognition, a lead, but the days began to pass, and the phones of the police department remained stubbornly silent. The investigation turned inward, to the vast archives of the city's bureaucracy. In rooms filled with tall metal filing cabinets, detectives began the immense task of sifting through paper records. Imagine them under the stark fluorescent lights late into the night, their fingers dusty from old paper as they pulled out heavy ledger books. They cross-referenced every missing child report, not just from Philadelphia, but from the surrounding states. They found hundreds of names, hundreds of family tragedies, but none matched the boy in the box. There was no report of a missing boy of his age and description who had not already been accounted for. They moved on to birth records, a monumental task in a PI digital age. They looked for children born between 4 and 6 years prior, hoping to find a loose thread, perhaps a family that had moved or a record with a notation of concern from a social worker. It was like searching for a single grain of sand on an endless beach. The paper trailed that documents a life of birth certificate, a doctor's visit. A school enrollment simply did not seem to exist for him. With the public appeal and the record search yielding nothing, the investigation moved to the streets. Detectives, always working in pairs, began the slow, grinding work of canvassing. They started in the Fox Chase neighborhood, knocking on every door, showing the poster to every resident. The response was always the same: a polite headshake, a sympathetic but vacant look. "I'm sorry, detective, I've never seen him before." They widened their circle, moving through neighborhood after neighborhood, They visited schools and playgrounds, speaking with teachers and principals. They showed the photo to men who delivered milk and mail, people whose jobs gave them a unique view of the city's daily life. No one knew him. It was a baffling, frustrating silence. A child cannot be invisible. A child plays, makes noise, has friends, is seen by neighbors. Yet this child seemed to have been a ghost even when he was alive. The search extended to the city's institutions. Detectives visited every orphanage, every foster home, every children's hospital. They spoke with priests and nuns, doctors and nurses, administrators and caregivers. The records were checked, the staff were questioned, and everywhere the result was the same. No child matching his description had been a resident. No child had vanished from their care. With each passing week, the hope that had energized the initial investigation began to fade, replaced by a quiet, persistent bewilderment. The case file grew thicker with reports, but every report ended in a question mark. Every lead turned into a dead end. The entire machinery of a major metropolitan police force was focused on this one case, yet it could find no purchase. The posters, once fresh and new, began to weather on the telephone poles and in the shop windows. Their corners curled, the ink faded by the sun and the rain. The city, which had been momentarily captivated by the mystery, began to move on, its attention drawn to new headlines, new dramas. But for the small group of detectives at the heart of the case, the boy's face was unforgettable. He was no longer just a case file. He was their silent ward, the child the entire city had somehow forgotten. And as the initial, frantic phase of the investigation drew to a close, they were left with a chilling, almost impossible conclusion. It was as if the boy in the box had never existed at all. Years began to turn into decades. The initial, frantic energy of the investigation settled into a long, quiet vigil. The case of the boy in the box was never closed. It simply grew cold, passed down from one generation of Philadelphia detectives to the next. The thick binder containing the case file became a fixture in the homicide division, a solemn reminder of a debt that remained unpaid. For the public, the boy became a piece of local folklore, a ghost story. But for the investigators and a handful of dedicated citizens, he remained a real child, waiting for his name. In the long silence of a cold case, theories begin to grow like moss in a shaded place. With no new evidence coming in, investigators and amateur sleuths alike would return to the original file, re-examining the same few facts, hoping to see a new pattern. Over the years, several compelling, yet ultimately unprovable, narratives emerged from the fore. One of the earliest and most enduring theories centered on a foster home located about 1.5 miles from where the box was found. Imagine the investigators, years after the initial search, looking at a map, their eyes drawn to this location. It seemed logical. A foster home was a place of transient children, a place where a child could potentially exist outside the normal records of a stable family unit. The theory began to take shape. Perhaps the boy was the illegitimate child of a member of the family who ran the home. Perhaps his death was an accident, a tragic fall or an illness that was improperly treated. And in a moment of panic, fearing scandal and ruin, the family decided to dispose of the body quietly, rather than notifying the authorities. This narrative seemed to fit some of the facts. The blankets found with the boy were similar to those used at the home. The hasty, crude haircut could have been an attempt to disguise his identity. Investigators pursued this lead diligently for years. They re-interviewed the family who ran the home and others who had lived there, but there was never a confession, never a definitive piece of evidence. The family denied any knowledge of the boy, and without more to go on, the foster home remained just a theory, a plausible but unproven scenario. Then, in the early 2000s, a new and much more dramatic story surfaced. One that seemed for a time to be the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. A woman who was referred to in investigative circles only as M came forward with a detailed and disturbing account. She claimed to have the answer because she had been there. Her story, told to investigators, painted a grim picture. She said that her own mother, a woman she described as being deeply abusive, had purchased the boy from his birth parents. The boy's name, she said, was Jonathan. According to M, the boy lived with them for a short time, suffering from the same terrible abuse that she did. She then claimed that one day, in a fit of rage after the boy had gotten sick, her mother committed an act of sudden, tragic violence, and the boy's life was ended. She went on to describe how her mother cut the boy's long hair and, with her help, drove his body to the wooded area in Fox Chase and left him in the box. The police took M's story very seriously. She seemed to know details about the crime scene that had not been widely publicized, such as the boy having eaten baked beans shortly before his death. It felt like a confession, a window into the dark secret. Investigators spent a great deal of time and resources trying to corroborate her story, but the more they dug, the more problems they found. M had a long history of severe mental illness, which made her a questionable narrator of events. They could find no independent evidence to support her claims. There were no records of her mother ever purchasing or having another child. The story, as compelling and detailed as it was, could never be proven. It was another promising road that ultimately led nowhere, leaving investigators with yet another ghost story. And so, with the theories providing no solid answers, all the investigation had left were the few silent physical objects found on that cold day in 1957. Let us quietly consider them. There was the box itself, an ordinary bassinet box from a J.C. Penney department store. Investigators had traced its manufacturing date. They knew that only 12 such bassinets had been shipped to the Philadelphia area. They tried to trace every single sale, but after so many years, the records were incomplete or gone. The trail went cold. The box, which once held the promise of a starting point, became just another dead end. And there was the blanket, a simple cotton flannel blanket with a faded plaid pattern of green and brown diamonds against a white background. It was worn, showing signs of frequent use and washing. For decades, it was preserved as a key piece of evidence. Samples were taken from it, analyzed with the forensic tools at the time, but it offered up no secrets. It was an ordinary blanket, the kind that could have been found in thousands of homes across America. It offered comfort, but no clues, for over 60 years. This was the state of the case, a collection of unprovable stories, a handful of mundane objects, and the haunting black and white photograph of a sleeping child who never woke up. The mystery seemed permanent, a puzzle with too many missing pieces, locked forever in the past. It seemed that science, memory, and detective work had all reached their limits, and the boy in the box would remain nameless forever. For more than 60 years, the mystery of the boy in the box was a story about the limits of human investigation, a story of closed doors, fading memories, and secrets that people take to their graves. But in the 21st century, a new kind of detective emerged, a detective that does not age, does not forget, and can read the stories written in the deepest parts of our being. That detective is science. Over the years, the case evidence had been meticulously preserved. In 1998, investigators made a fateful decision. The boy's body was exhumed from its grave in Ivy Hill Cemetery, where he had been buried beneath a simple headstone that read America's Unknown Child. Tissue samples were carefully taken with the goal of extracting his DNA. The technology at the time was still limited, and the initial efforts yielded no conclusive results. But the samples were saved, waiting for a day when science could finally catch up to the mystery. That day came 2 decades later. With the rise of advanced DNA techniques and the field of genetic genealogy, it became possible to do what was science fiction in 1957. Investigators no longer needed an eyewitness or a confession. All they needed was a distant relative, a living person who had uploaded their own DNA profile to a public database like GetMatch or Ancestry.net. Imagine a team of scientists and genealogists working patiently in quiet laboratories. They took the boy's tiny, degraded DNA profile, amplified it, analyzed it, and uploaded it into these databases. Then, the digital search began. They were not looking for a perfect match, but for second, third, or even fourth cousins. People who shared a small fraction of the boy's genetic code. After months of painstaking work, the long-awaited moment arrived. They found a match. It was distant, on the boy's maternal side. With that one tiny genetic thread, the genealogists began to build a massive family tree, working backwards through generations using public records like birth, marriage, and death certificates and old newspaper articles to piece together the puzzle of a family that did not know it had a lost child. Once his mother's family tree was built, they repeated the process, searching for relatives on his father's side. And finally, after years of meticulous work, the 2 family trees intersected at a single point, at a couple who had lived in Philadelphia in the 1950s, and at a child who had been born to them. In December of 2022, after 65 years of silence, The Philadelphia Police Department held a press conference. The commissioner stood before the cameras and announced to the world that the mystery was solved. The boy in the box was no longer an anonymous symbol. He was a person. His real name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. It was a real name, a name he had carried for short years. And with the name came a complex family story, one the police were not entirely prepared to share out of respect for living relatives. But they revealed that Joseph had living siblings, and that his parents were long deceased. Knowing his name was a monumental confrontation with the past. It brought a poignant conclusion to one of America's oldest and saddest cold cases. The detectives who had inherited the case, the scientists who had worked tirelessly, and the citizens who had never forgotten the boy, all felt the weight of history lift. But solving one mystery opened another. Now that they knew who Joseph was, they had to ask who was responsible for his death. The homicide investigation is still active. Police still hope that the revelation of his identity might lead to people coming forward with information. People who may have known the family at the time, who may have seen something. And yet, the legacy of Joseph Zarelli's case is no longer just a story of an unsolved crime. It has become a story about the power of persistence and of a community that never gave up the search for a child's name. It is a reminder that no one is truly unknown, and that the truth, no matter how long it is buried, can find its way to the light. And so, we come to the end of our story. A story that began with a nameless body in a box, and ended with a name reclaimed from the past by science and by patience. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He is no longer just a boy in the box. He is a child who had a name, a family, and a short, tragic life. As you lie here, in the quiet of your room, think of the long journey it took for that name to return. 65 years of unanswered questions and of tireless effort. It is a quiet reminder that even in a world that can seem vast and indifferent, there is value in every single life. And there are people who will not stop seeking justice, no matter how much time has passed. Now, let the details of the case fade. Let the names of the detectives, the theories, and the strands of DNA drift away. They are no longer important tonight. All that matters now is the silence that follows the story. Feel the quiet settle over you, like a warm blanket. Listen to the rhythm of your own breath, slow and steady. There are no more mysteries to solve, nothing more to think about. The story has been told, and now it is time for rest. Let your mind drift into a calm, dark space, where there is only comfort and deep, peaceful sleep. Good night.